Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Set up after the horrors of the Second World War, the United Nations was meant to provide a forum that could prevent similar conflict. No wars since have matched the bloodshed of that era, but 80 years after its inception, diplomacy is dominated, just as it was then, by the big powers of the United Nations Security Council, and many would argue it's doing little to curb much of today's violence. Its whole setup is outdated. Our next guest has long been advocating reform of the body. He's Carne Ross, a former British diplomat who set up the world's first NGO dedicated to diplomacy. Hello and welcome, Carne.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you with us, Carne. I've known you for, some time. You're back in Kosovo when you were a diplomat back there. Tell us, how did you get into diplomacy? I presume after university, you were one of those super bright kids who applied to join the Foreign Office.
Well, I did apply when I was at university. I didn't get in the first time of trying. It took me 2 attempts, but I eventually got in a year or so after leaving university. So I was pretty young and far too young, really, to take on that kind of responsibility.
And what kind of things did you, you were in the fast stream, so you fairly quickly you get to do quite a lot of pretty important things.
Yeah, it's a fun job. As long as you don't ask too many questions, you get extraordinary access to information from a very early start. You get access to top secret information from MI6 and from GCHQ. You have access to the foreign minister and to other senior officials. You're dealing with sometimes with very, very grave issues, wars, peace treaties, global warming, and you're given extraordinary responsibilities. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. You fairly soon, I think you found yourself at the UN in New York. What was your job there?
Well, I was head of the Middle East section of the UK mission to the UN, which meant I dealt with Middle East issues as they arose on the agenda of primarily the UN Security Council, but also the UN General Assembly and other organs of the UN. So in those days, my primary issues that I took an interest in were, it was Libya, the Lockerbie case, getting the 2 accused for Lockerbie to trial, eventually in The Hague. The Western Sahara, which I then got much more involved in later, Israel-Palestine, which of course was then still a problem just as it is now, but above all Iraq, where I spent most of my time on the UN resolutions that followed the Iraq War, which required Iraq to disarm itself of its infamous weapons of mass destruction.
When you say you're talking about the first Iraq War in 1991. So this is the late 90s we're really talking about, are we here?
Yeah, I started in right at the end of 98 and stayed there till the middle of 2002. So yeah, we're talking about the first Iraq War, but it was, came to be actually in the run up to the second Iraq War, if we can call it that.
That was a critical period, and you did your job very professionally. You fought hard, I think, as a diplomat for Britain's cause as you saw it then.
Yeah, I was a devoted diplomat. I was called a Rottweiler because I was so aggressive and trenchant in my defense of what Britain wanted at the UN Security Council. The Brits have a incredibly privileged position at the UN Security Council because they're a P5 member, a member of the Permanent Five, veto-wielding members of the Security Council, which gives you extraordinary power and influence at the UN. You're really one of the top dogs there. For instance, we drafted pretty much every resolution that came to be passed on the issues that I worked on. So we were convening the 15 council members for negotiations about these resolutions, which then become international law. And the working language of the UN is English, even though it's supposed to be French as well. It's predominantly English. And that gives English speakers a huge advantage as well. And the Brits still are, of course, close to the most powerful country in the world, the US. So that too gave us significant influence.
I think it's worthwhile just talking about how that works technically. So, on the Security Council, you say there are those 5 permanent members, but there's rotating, there are 10 other members. Just can you talk about how that works? And also, I mean, what is a resolution? What's the aim of a resolution?
Sure. Well, let's start with that. A resolution is a piece of paper that emerges from agreement in the UN Security Council and needs to be agreed and not vetoed by any of the permanent members. So you need to have a majority of 9 members to get a resolution agreed and no vetoes. So that's the minimum requirement to agree a resolution. A resolution can have the force of international law if it's a so-called Chapter 7 resolution, which is obligatory on all the member states, all 193 member states of the UN Security Council. So it can be things like authorizing a peacekeeping mission, demanding that a country remove itself after occupying another, imposing sanctions on a country, for instance, North Korea or Iraq, because it's not disarming. It can be a whole host of things. And the UN Security Council has passed many thousands of resolutions in its lifetime. But it also passes what are called presidential statements, which do not have the force of law, but have a kind of declaratory force that the UN Security Council is saying something important. And the least powerful form of expression of the UN Security Council is so-called press statements, where the current chair of the council, they take it in turns every month to chair the council, comes out and briefs the press along pre-agreed lines. We are very concerned about the situation between the Houthis and Israel or whatever. So there's quite a lot of technicality that goes into the UN Security Council. I mean, when you see it meet in that big meeting room at the UN, that's actually one of the least common iterations of its activities. That's a so-called open meeting, which takes place in public in front of the cameras, with all the 193 member states in attendance. Most of the council's real business is done in so-called informal consultations, which are not actually official meetings at all, but have the appearance to a participant of an official meeting. You're sitting around a little table, not that big table that you see on the cameras, but a little table in a room to the side of that, very cramped, lots of diplomats crammed in there, trying to do the argy-bargy of agreeing a position on something like the war on Ukraine or the war in Gaza, something like that, to pick 2 issues where, of course, they've been unable to reach any agreement in recent months and years. So it's real negotiation. I mean, it's a great place to be a diplomat because you're actually doing hard negotiation about rules of international law that become obligatory. So it's a big deal. It really matters. And all the 193 member states pay great attention to what goes on at the UN Security Council. It's really, by a long way, the most important organ of the UN. UN Development Programme, UNDP, the UNFCCC, the Treaty on Climate Change, the Agreement on Climate Change. All of these are very important in their particular realms, but arguably war and peace and security is the most important realm. And there, the UN Security Council is the world's supreme body for dealing with issues of peace and security council. Peace and security. So it really matters what goes on in there. And it has its own particular cultures of behavior. It has its own what are called working methods, which are the sort of procedural rules that govern how business is done in there, who can talk in there, who can address the council about their issue, et cetera, et cetera. And I've taken a particular interest in that, but we can perhaps get into that later.
I mean, I'm glad you sort of emphasize its importance and its influence. And I think all too often people can say, well, what's the UN doing about it? As though it's got the remedy for everything. And also particularly in an era of populism where sovereign nationalists see the UN or any international body as an infringement of their own state's ability to act. It is still, 80 years on, an incredibly important body. I mean, just to state that very obvious thing.
Yeah, I agree. And, what's remarkable about it is that every member state of the UN, which is basically every country in the world, barring a couple, still regards it as the supreme body for peace and security council, for peace and security. They still to a greater or lesser extent, abide by its decisions, and they care about it. And that's really quite incredible, 70 years, 75 years after its foundation, that all these countries still regard that body as supreme. I think one passing comment I would make is that, in the outside world, people talk about, quote unquote, the UN, but in reality, there is no one UN. There is either the Security Council or the Secretary General, who, of course, speaks independently, although he is appointed by the member states and has to be approved by the Permanent Five in particular. And then there's the General Assembly. And these are three different iterations of what the UN is saying. So when you say the UN in Israel or Gaza, who do you actually mean? Do you mean Antonio Guterres, or do you mean the UN Security Council? So the UN, Guterres has spoken out a great deal about what's gone on in Gaza, for instance. But the UN Security Council, because of the American veto, has been unable to agree anything except a pretty weak resolution on access for humanitarian aid. So there you see two different iterations of the UN, which are important and which are involved. And then, of course, there was a further vote in the General Assembly on Gaza, where a thumping majority voted in favor of a ceasefire, and a decision that the US could not veto, because there are no vetoes in the General Assembly. But a decision that does not have the force of law. So much more declaratory than a resolution that would go through the UN Security Council. And these distinctions, which are important in international law and in geopolitical terms, are often lost in the public debate.
Okay, I want to come back to those mechanisms and how they work, and also, of course, about the P5 and their membership of it. But just to start with, I want to talk about your experience. At what point did you become uncomfortable or have a notion that what you might be doing was not entirely right when you were doing your job there?
Well, it was all about Iraq. And I joined the UK mission in the latter stages of the sanctions regime that was imposed on Iraq after the first Gulf War. And those sanctions were very stringent economic sanctions that at the beginning prevented all imports and exports to Iraq, except a very small subset of goods, so-called humanitarian goods. And I began to feel very uncomfortable with my personal role, but also my country's role in enforcing those sanctions. Because by the late 90s and the early 2000s, it was pretty clear that sanctions and the Iraq regime's compliance with them, or lack of compliance with them, was causing very significant humanitarian harm in Iraq. And I was very uneasy about it, but I still did it. I still negotiated those resolutions and sat in the UN Security Council and what was called the 661 Committee, which was the UN Sanctions Committee on Iraq. And, talked about the need for countries to enforce those strictures on Iraq and to stop exporting the bulk of goods to Iraq, and to prevent Iraq selling its oil except through a UN-approved program, which was called the Oil for Food Program. Although as time went on, Iraq began to sell more and more oil illegally through different routes. And I look back on that time with considerable shame, really, because I did nothing meaningful to question that sanctions regime, and that regime did enormous harm to the Iraqi people and to the Iraqi economy, arguably as much harm as the war that was to follow. But the big breach for me came with the war, and in particular with the false case that the government made for war, that Iraq was a threat due to its holdings of weapons of mass destruction. I had worked specifically on this issue for several years. I had been instrumental in setting up the UN Weapons Inspection Agency called UNMAVIC, which was an acronym I came up with late one night during the negotiations of the resolution that set it up. And I witnessed what my government was saying about this alleged threat from Iraq in the run-up to the 2003 war. And I realized this was very, very different from what I knew to be the case. And I had been very familiar with deeply familiar with the intelligence on Iraq. Me and a guy called David Kelly, whose name has now become famous, would brief UN Security Council diplomats about the supposed threat on WMD from Iraq. And the bottom line is that whilst we believe that Iraq had not fully disarmed of its WMD, inside the British government and with our close ally, the United States, we said clearly that we did not believe Iraq was a threat, that we had successfully contained the threat through the arms embargo, which was part of the sanctions regime, and we had prevented Iraq from substantially rearming. And the intelligence was pretty clear that whilst there may have been remnants of Iraq's original stocks of missiles, chemical weapons, and biological weapons, they did not constitute a meaningful threat in any way. And yet, in the run-up to the 2003 war, the British government said precisely the opposite. They said that Iraq was a threat. And I eventually resigned over that. But I didn't resign at the time the war started or as the government was making these propagandistic claims. I didn't resign until I was invited to testify to the Butler Review, which was the first official inquiry into the use of intelligence before the war, where I was approached because of my role to give evidence. And I decided to give evidence in secret because my evidence would be very, very critical of what the government had been saying on a number of grounds, not just the claims about WMD, but also the claim that there was no alternative to war. And I myself had worked on a paper that was about changing the sanctions regime to make it sustainable in the long run, which was an alternative to war. And thirdly, the war was a breach of the resolutions that I myself had negotiated. In other words, a breach of international law, which I think is now accepted as the kind of, conventional view of what took place, that the war was illegal, as well as based on a lie. But that, at the time I submitted my evidence, that wasn't so much the debate. And when I submitted my evidence, I realized that I could not say this in private or in secret to the Butler inquiry and carry on as a British diplomat with a clear conscience. I couldn't go back to London and sit there with ministers and the Prime Minister who I knew to have lied and to have caused death, and including the death of my colleague David Kelly. It was a very bitter moment. I was, in fact, in Kosovo when I resigned. I submitted my evidence from a computer in the UN headquarters in Kosovo, where I was then working. And when I quit, I had to give up that job immediately because I was on secondment from the British government, and I returned to Britain.
There are two things there. Obviously, there's the conduct of the British government and your criticism of it and your disillusionment with how the British government had treated the case for the war, invasion of Iraq. So that's one thing. But Britain had or has an enormously privileged role, as you say, as a member of the P5. And is that I'm trying to sort of connect the two in terms of your critique of the UN. And it's a very obvious thing to say. Why should those 5 countries still be there?
Well, the reason they're still there is because nobody's been able to agree how to replace them or to reform the UN security.
But at the time, was that part of your concern? I mean, obviously, you were primarily concerned about how the British government was making its case for war. At that time, did you have, or were there other areas within your conduct within the UN that you were not happy about? And I'm particularly interested in how the Security Council could make very important decisions that would affect millions of people, and how those decisions might be undertaken.
Yeah, one of the things I realized, above all, after the experience, when I reflected on the experience of being at the UN Security Council, was how distant it was from the circumstances that it was arbitrating. So when we were talking about Iraq and the humanitarian effects on the Iraqi population, we had no access to Iraq. We were several thousand miles away. We relied on very arid reports from the UN about what was going on, which were very carefully drafted to avoid offending some of the powerful UN Security Council members like us and like the Americans. There was no access for the Iraqi people to speak to the UN Security Council. Of course, the Iraqi state was allowed to speak at the UN. They weren't invited to speak to the UN Security Council, but of course they weren't truly representative of what the Iraqi people needed. It was a vicious, authoritarian regime under Saddam Hussein. So, what I began dimly to realize was this enormous distance between the council and the places it was talking about was a bad thing, that it meant that the decisions were much worse and didn't really take account of the truth of what was going on the ground, or the real needs and interests of the people on the ground. And that, I wrote a book about all of this fairly soon after that experience, and I started to call it the diplomatic deficit. This gap between the organs of diplomacy and the diplomats making these decisions and reality. And that gap was a real problem. And that, unfortunately, that gap remains. It was perhaps particularly acute during the Iraq sanctions years, because I have no doubt that if the 15 of us of the Security Council had gone to Iraq, talked to doctors, talked to medical professionals, humanitarian workers, and above all to the Iraqi people, we would have been able to agree about what to do. We would have done a lot more to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the Iraqi people. And we didn't do it. I myself tried to go to Iraq. I was not given a visa by the Iraqi government. They hated me, because I was one of the instruments of their burden. I was the chief British diplomat on Iraq at the UN Security Council. I didn't really know much about Iraq. I don't speak Arabic. I never went there. I went there many years later. That is not a good position from which to take life and death decisions about a country.
How then do you go about reforming it? I mean, later I know that your political ideas have developed substantially since then, and I'm going to come on to that in a second, which might actually questions the whole idea of the way the UN is structured and run, indeed how governments are run and structured. And we'll put that to the side for the moment. What's your is there an easy remedy? Do you get rid of the P? First of all, you get rid of the P5. How do you make it more representative? How do you make it more inclusive?
Well, there's two things that are important in my view. One is making the council more representative, which is a very familiar debate about who should be a permanent member, what should happen to the veto, should there be new non-permanent members or so-called elected members, should it be India, Japan, South Africa, Brazil. These are the kind of names that are bandied around when talking about Security Council enlargement. So that's one very, very tortured, tendentious issue on which the world has been unable to agree for many decades. And I don't see any real signs of it that's any closer to agreement at the moment. There are some straws in the wind. That's one issue. The other issue goes back to what I was talking about, the diplomatic deficit, and is much, much easier to address, which is that the Security Council should meet the people it is concerning itself with, should meet the groups on the agenda for discussion. And that is very simple for it to agree to do. It can just decide to do it, as a member of the Security Council can say. And this happened during the Bosnian War. A member of the Security Council can say, look, I've got somebody outside this room who we need to hear from about what's going on. And the Bosnian ambassador had a Croatian priest who had witnessed massacres during the Bosnian War. And he took his fellow ambassadors out of the room to the UN Diplomats Lounge, which is just up the way from the Security Council. And he sat them down with this priest to hear his accounts of the massacres in the Bosnian War, the massacres of Bosniaks in particular. And that started to become a procedure called the ARIA formula, because it was the Venezuelan ambassador, I think he was called Oscar Arias, Aria, who instituted this procedure. And that is a very easy procedure for the council to use, and it does currently use that a reasonable amount. What it doesn't do, though, is on a systematic basis meet the parties from these conflicts that it is arbitrating. And with the non-profit diplomatic group that I founded, we began to organize these meetings ourselves because the Security Council wasn't doing it itself. So when there was a conflict in South Sudan, we arranged for the members of the UN Security Council to meet, sometimes virtually, representatives of the parties in South Sudan to hear from the horse's mouth their perspective and what might be done to end the conflict. And I think that is a very, very easy reform of the Security Council that could be done on a systematic basis right now. Doesn't need a two-thirds majority of the General Assembly, doesn't need reform of the UN Charter, which changing the membership of the UN Security Council does require.
I want to get questions from people, please. So please do put your questions. Now is the time. So please put them down in the Q&A box, and then you can put your question directly to Carne. Carne, when we do these study tours everywhere where it's safe to do so, and we've spent quite a bit of time. We used to go to Russia a lot and Ukraine, and we go to the Baltics a lot. And there's a politician there called Margus Taskner, and he's now the foreign minister for Estonia. And he advocates, very obviously, he thinks that Russia should no longer have the right to be on the P5. If you've got a country that has waged war of aggression, invaded another country with no cause, one can think of the United States and Iraq, of course, there should be some kind of penalty, and really it shouldn't be there any longer. And you've made the point already, this is a very difficult one to address. It's highly unlikely to be changed. But do you detect any momentum in the wake of what's happened in Ukraine?
The Russian veto over decisions of the Council over its invasion of Ukraine has caused a lot of frustration in the broader UN membership, which has heightened the temperature around calls for reform of the UN Security Council. But when they mean reform of the Security Council, they mean enlarging the Security Council to perhaps 20 or 25 members. Unfortunately, there's not the slightest prospect of removing the veto from any of the permanent members, or indeed, let alone removing one of the permanent members themselves. I mean, there should be rules of conduct that you can't go around invading other countries without cause, and that disqualifies you from membership of the UN Security Council. But unfortunately, there isn't such a rule. I mean, there are efforts to limit the veto, for instance, to limit it in cases of war crimes, genocide, or other atrocities, that it can't be used in such cases. But even that has not been formally agreed, and it's as a kind of informal norm, it's not really taking hold. And Ukraine and Gaza kind of prove that point. But unfortunately, I mean, the Estonian foreign minister is on the wrong track. I mean, rhetorically, he's absolutely right. It's an outrage that Russia behaves like this and is able to veto Security Council action on Ukraine. But you have to remember, when the Security Council was set up, it was set up to preserve peace between the great powers. It wasn't necessarily set up only, I mean, it was established as the world's primary organ for peace and security, but it was less interested in conflict elsewhere. It was most interested in conflict between the great powers, preventing another Second World War. And one of the prices that the great powers exacted for establishing the UN Security Council was the right to protect their own interests under any circumstances. And that was the reason for the veto. And so this goes back to the heart of the political purpose of the UN. And there's other paradoxes involved in all of this, which is also that if you make the UN Security Council more representative and bigger, you also arguably make it less effective, because it makes it much harder to get agreement. If you have India or South Africa on the Security Council, and they have been on the Security Council and had to a degree demonstrated this by their behavior, it's not necessarily going to make the decisions of the Security Council any better. Both of those countries have sat on the fence about Ukraine and have been unwilling unequivocally to condemn Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. So if you had them on the Security Council, and they're two of the countries that are most often mentioned as the most plausible candidates for new permanent seats on the Security Council, would it make for better decisions? I would argue actually it probably would not. And there are other paradoxical effects, which is that the veto means that if a country does not veto it, it is obliged to implement that resolution. Let me try to break that down, what I mean by that. What it means is that a country can't say, well, we didn't like this resolution. The US or Russia or China or Britain or France can't say, we didn't like this resolution, therefore we're not going to implement it, because they have the power to veto it. So if they don't like it, they have to veto it, and it never happens. But if it's agreed, say by a majority vote, which some people should think should be the case in the Security Council, countries like Russia or China can just say, well, we didn't vote for it, so it doesn't matter. And I was part of negotiating a resolution. In fact, the resolution that established the weapons inspection body in Iraq, where 3 permanent members abstained on the vote. They didn't vote for it. They didn't veto it, but they abstained, which showed a kind of ambivalence in their position. And as a result, partly as a result, not only as a result, Iraq said, we're not going to implement this resolution because these 3 permanent members have abstained. So you can see there is a kind of paradoxical effect of the veto, which in a sense ties these great powers into the Security Council in a way that, if the Security Council was busy passing ceasefire resolutions on Gaza, what do you think the US would do? They would say it doesn't matter. They said to hell with the UN. That's not what they say today. They say the UN really matters, but we're not going to allow it to agree a ceasefire on Gaza. I mean, this is reprehensible and objectionable to the vast majority of the UN membership, but it doesn't mean that the US dissociates itself entirely from the UN. And I think that matters in a way. It's a perverse effect of the veto.
Vaughan Grills, you've got a question, but I think your question has been answered, Vaughan. So if you've got a follow-up, do you think that's a satisfactory answer, Vaughan? So if you've got a follow-up, ask.
Well, it's a logical, satisfactory answer, of course, but it's not a sort of moral one in a way. I mean, because the Security Council was set up, well, it goes back to Roosevelt, of course, without saying the world's 4 policemen: China, Soviet Union, Britain, and the US. But of course, the thing is that those 4 countries, the fundamental flaw in it is that they would then, after the war, were rivals in many ways. And that's the fundamental problem. And I just wonder whether is it all possible to rethink the whole thing and not have a Security Council in the way it's set up with permanent membership. That is the crux of the problem, isn't it? Because, before the Cold War, now we have Russia with its veto. Now, say in Israel and we have America with its veto. We're not getting anywhere. Is there any way we could reconfigure that at all so there isn't a Security Council in the way it's set up now?
Well, Carne, you clearly think it's. I know, Carne, you clearly think it's wrong, but we're talking about realpolitik, and they're not going to vote themselves out of a job. In a moment, we'll come to the way in which you think it's profoundly wrong, and your ideas about democracy have moved on in quite some way. But I'm not too sure if there's anything more to add to what you said previously, Carne, in terms of Vaughan's question or statement.
Well, I think in an ideal world, Vaughan is absolutely right. I mean, it is deeply regrettable, to put it mildly, that Russia is able to veto resolutions about its own egregious and illegal behavior in Ukraine, and the Americans can protect Israel as they slaughter tens of thousands of Palestinians. This is deeply objectionable. But despite the frustration about that in the broader UN membership, there is no proposal for reform that would abolish the permanent members, because the reason there is no proposal for reform that would abolish the permanent members is because the permanent members have to agree to any proposal for reform. So to get any reform through and amend the UN Charter, for instance, to change the membership of the UN Security Council, you have to get a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly, which is hard enough to do in the first place. And you have to get all the Security Council, including the P5, to agree to it. So Turkeys are not going to vote for Christmas. Any proposal that says we're going to abolish the P5 will never be passed. So all the proposals to reform the Security Council include keeping the P5, not necessarily as it currently is, perhaps expanding the permanent membership, but not extending the veto, because the veto is the thing that people really object to. And you can see why right now in Gaza, as we saw also in Ukraine. And, every permanent member has exercised the veto at times, some more than others, Russia much more than others, for instance. But it is the veto that causes the most political angst, more broadly. And perhaps that can be reformed and its use restricted through normative practice and shaming countries, though, how much shame Putin's Russia feels in the current circumstance or ever is open to question.
Carne, your sort of political thinking has moved on, as I've indicated before a couple of times. After you resigned, you went to the New School. What did you in New York? What did you look at there, and how did that sort of prompt your sort of change in views about both the state and the structure of politics?
Well, when I left the Foreign Office, and in fact this happened slightly before because I went on sabbatical from the Foreign Office before I resigned. I went to the New School and I read in the New York University Library, which is associated with the New School. And I asked myself a bigger question, which is what is wrong with our current system of representative democracy and capitalism? Why is it not delivering results? Why is it so incredibly unjust that in a city like New York City, where I was living, children, a few miles to the north could be literally starving, whilst downtown people were living it up and champagne and cocaine. And likewise, in the climate, even by then in the early 2000s, it was very clear that the climate was going in very much the wrong direction, let alone the sense since 9/11 of kind of perpetual war. We were then deep in the global war against terror, wars going on in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so, I began to ask, what are the deeper problems here? Is there a better way of addressing this? And came to certain conclusions that led me to a kind of gentle form of anarchism, a belief in bottom-up self-government as the answer, that representative democracy is not a particularly good way of organizing ourselves democratically, that there are much better ways which are much more inclusive, where people
I do want to say in the interim, because there's maybe I'm wrong. I don't know if you immediately came to that conclusion and you said, right, I'm now a form of anarchist straight away. But I do want to say, you set up this NGO, the Independent Diplomat, and you worked primarily with governments that hadn't been recognized or didn't have a proper diplomatic service. So you were providing the poor and the marginalized in terms of states or statelets or regions an ability to have some kind of representation on the world stage. In other words, giving them kind of a global democratic representation within the diplomatic world.
That's right. And that was not an anarchist venture in any way. It was set up to address the diplomatic deficit, which I referred to earlier, basically to help underrepresented groups, democratic countries, groups of people be heard in the corridors of diplomacy and advance their interests in ways where they would be properly taken account of. So we did tend to help would-be states like Somaliland and Kosovo, Western Sahara, and other places. But we also helped democratic political movements that were fighting autocratic regimes, for instance, in Syria, in South Yemen today, the representatives of the indigenous population of Western Sahara, for instance. And we would help them get their voice heard through the use of diplomatic technique and strategy, which we as a group of former diplomats were familiar with. So we were essentially putting the skills of powerful countries at the disposal of less powerful groups and countries, and helping them make their way through the thickets of the, institutional complexities of diplomacy, which are considerable.
Can you talk, I think we'll come up with the example first and then expand it out to the theory, and that's to talk about the region, Kurdish region within northern Syria. And I think, is it the city or town of Rojava?
Well, the region in Kurdish is called Rojava of northeast Syria, which is actually Western Kurdistan, because Kurdistan is divided into four, with northern Kurdistan in southern Turkey, eastern Kurdistan in northern Iran, and southern Kurdistan in northern Iraq. And the western bit is called Rojava. And this is a region of of northeast Syria. Sorry, I've said that very confusingly, but Rojava is a predominantly Kurdish region of northeast Syria.
But it's its system of government that's intrigued you, isn't it?
Yes, and I went there and filmed it for a documentary about anarchism. And essentially what they have done is, when the Assad regime collapsed in 2013, some years ago now, they established a bottom-up form of government based on the ideas of an American anarchist called Murray Bookchin, whose ideas were translated for the Kurdish context by the leader of the PKK, which is the Kurdish liberation movement, predominantly in Turkey, but not only in Turkey, a guy called Abdullah Öcalan, who remains in Turkish prison. And he interpreted these ideas of Bookchin for the Kurdish context, and they were then implemented in Rojava. And basically what it is bottom-up self-government in a confederal sense, where every decision is taken at the communal level, so the village level, and only when necessary are decisions taken upstream to a confederal body where these communes are represented to take decisions collectively. So it addresses one of the many criticisms of anarchism, that how does it operate at scale? Well, it operates through a confederal system. It's not terribly complicated. But that is happening in Rojava, and is still happening. And it's a remarkable thing to see. It gets very, very little attention internationally because the Kurdish people, or the Kurdish issue, doesn't really fit into many narratives of right or left about what's going on. Rojava is able to exist partly because of an American military presence in northeast Syria. Not many people know that the Americans have troops in Syria, but they have a special forces deployment in northeast Syria, which is there to fight ISIS, but it has the secondary effect of deterring a major Turkish military incursion into northeast Syria to destroy Rojava and destroy what the Kurds have built there, which is undoubtedly what Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, would prefer to do if he had the opportunity. And, Turkey has, to this day, engages in airstrikes and other forms of interference in Rojava, because they believe that the dispensation in Rojava is basically part of the PKK, which they have fought for many decades in a most egregious and repressive fashion, and continue to do so today. And they would like to occupy Rojava, there's no question. And it's only, a few American special forces soldiers standing in their way that has prevented them.
I choose that. It's probably a dramatic example because of the region it's in, but there are other areas too where these experiments in democratic participation have also taken place. You've highlighted Porto Alegre in Brazil. Can you talk briefly about that? Basically, I'm going to come back to the UN, but I want to talk about your examples of where you think this participatory democracy is working and could work.
Yeah, well, Porto Alegre is one of the great examples of participatory democracy, and they certainly would not call it anarchism. They would just call it a more inclusive way of taking decisions. And they had a 10-year experiment with participatory democracy where tens of thousands of people would take part in debates about how to allocate the city's budget. Should it be spent on education or sanitation or roads or whatnot? And at the beginning of the experiment, and this was showed by a World Bank study into what happened there, Porto Alegre was a very unequal city with a very deprived periphery of favelas that were, very poverty-stricken, and a rich center. And that imbalance was to a significant degree addressed by the participatory process. There was a massive increase in the provision of primary schools, of primary healthcare, of water and sanitation in the poorer areas, et cetera, which is not a surprise, because when everybody gets a fair crack of the whip in making a decision, those decisions are fairer. And hitherto, the political system had been dominated by cronyist and corrupt political parties, and those political parties basically disappeared. One of the interesting consequences was politics became depoliticized or de-party politicized. and became much more about, what are the rights and wrongs of this particular decision, a much more rational, sensible, and inclusive process. And I think this stands as an example that we would do well to consider and perhaps imitate, to address the fact that people are very disillusioned with representative democracy, not just in Britain but also elsewhere. People do not feel represented. People do not feel part of their decisions. But capitalism, meanwhile, has created a situation of great inequality where people feel cut out.
I think there are people who, the criticism of it, when there are many people who praise the system, and there have been lots of other experiments around the world that have also gone well. But the question is, how do you include everyone? How do you make that system work? This country, 67 million people, is it 67 million people? How do we all get involved? Is that actually practical? And I think there was an interview of you in the Guardian. The journalist had I think he'd spent time in Christiania and in
Denmark.
Where people had really got fed up of attending the meeting every week to decide what was going to be done with the bins and how they could treat someone's alcoholic addiction or whatever it was. But it was just it's impractical.
Well, I don't think it's impractical. As Porto Alegre demonstrates, people are willing to show up to meetings when something is at stake. If you have just meetings about, litter or the route of the bicycle path around the park, people find meetings understandably very tedious and burdensome. But if it's about the future of your local school, where your kids go, or your hospital where you get treated for illness, you are going to show up to that discussion. Yeah. And yes, it means more meetings, but that is the price of representation. That is the price of inclusion. I find it absolutely staggering that people put up with a system where all the major decisions are essentially taken by one man. Who dominates the cabinet, appoints his cronies to the cabinet, and his decisions and the cabinet's decisions are enforced for literally everybody else in the country, in a government that is always elected by a minority of the adult population, 35% or something of the adult population. I find that an extraordinary situation, that people should think that's okay. And to support it, to defend it because it's efficient, seems to me to be taking the wrong criterion as your primary concern in the hierarchy of what matters. To me, what matters is that people should feel they have agency over their affairs. They should feel included. They should feel that.
And how does that work with political parties and the development of ideologies, people voting for ideologies, and they're just the way those are expressed and executed within government?
It's a good question. I don't know what it would mean. I hope it would mean the end of political parties, because I hate political parties because they're basically so stupid and simplistic, and they force people to take oppositional positions which are unnecessary. I think, that guy down the road who votes Tory who you hate, or votes Labour who you hate, when you see that he has kids at the same school that you do, you're going to meet him at that meeting about the school, and you will see that his interests are legitimate, and you will see him as a real human being rather than as a political label. And thereby, my political proposal would help restitch the somewhat tattered fabric of society. That we live in a very alienated society where there's an awful lot of social hostility in the public realm. Whether you're driving down the motorway and somebody hoots at you, or kids stabbing each other, our society is not in a happy position. And this kind of politics would help, I think, bring people together around common concerns and help them understand each other as real human beings, face to face. This is not, by the way, I'm not proposing a virtual process where, you vote online for the proposal that you like of what to do with £1 million of local council money. That has its place, that has its virtues, that kind of system, and is better than the current system. But I'm talking about face-to-face meetings where we discuss what really matters to us in our local town, and we hear each other, and that process itself is the point. It's not just the way of making decisions, it's actually the process itself. And this is one of the cardinal beliefs of anarchism, in fact, of Mahatma Gandhi, which is the means are the ends. The means by which you take a decision is actually part of the ultimate effect of what you're doing.
I want to come back then to the UN, and I think I can understand how this fits with your idea that the UN should be more representative and include the people it's making the decisions on. But I think your other critique of it is that nations or states like to have a monopoly of power when it comes to dealing with crises, and not having to delve into why they. If you had that consultative process, I suppose you could argue it undermines your ability to take decisions quickly. It's too prolonged, and the state would much prefer to have the freedom to do what it wants. So that's your critique in there, but that doesn't. The thing I get confused about then is you're in favour of this institution, which you still believe should be making these decisions, intervening in crises, intervening in conflicts in a way that I think we've sort of pulled back from.
Or are you asking, do I still believe in the UN?
Yes, essentially.
That's the essence of your question.
Yeah.
Look, we live in a state-based world. We have a Westphalian system of organizing the world. I don't like it. I wish it was, system of bottom-up governments around the world, because I think they would get on much better, because they'd be much more about the common interests of their people rather than these manufactured so-called national interests, which are completely artificial constructs of people like me when I was a diplomat, and politicians who think that a state has this thing called interests. I think that idea is basically absurd, when in fact, as humans, we have identical common needs, whether for food, shelter, spiritual sustenance, or whatever. So, of course, I would like to see that Westphalian system. Sorry, a child in the background. I'd like to see that Westphalian system replaced, but that's not going to come about through reform of the UN. It's going to come about through bottom-up revolution, basically, whether in Rojava or Porto Alegre or in London. So for now, we've got a state-based system, and I think it's incredibly important that in a state-based system, you have a place where countries talk to each other, and that place is the UN. And at a minimum, it is that. It is a place where countries communicate their needs to each other, and that is important at a minimum. And it is much more than that. It is also a place where states... So I'm just going to shut the door because my daughter is yelling.
No, you're fine.
Sorry about that. I'm back. It is also a place where, for instance, and remarkably, 193 countries have agreed about what to do about climate change. What one may be skeptical, and rightly skeptical, of the COPs, but at the end of the day, 193 countries sign up to what is agreed at the COPs under the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. That's pretty remarkable. Likewise, there are global disarmament agreements. Or agreements about what should be the goal of economic development, the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, that those were agreed by 193 countries. I find that pretty remarkable. Yes, the UN is divided over Ukraine, it's divided over Gaza, but we're still talking about a world that is framed by the values of the UN and the rules of the UN, and documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I think has had an extraordinary normative force ever since it was agreed. Now we talk about human rights and we understand what they mean. They may not be respected everywhere by any means, but it is an intellectual frame which is immensely important, and it really does denote progress.
Yeah, and with that, just coming back to that idea of humanitarian intervention, I mean, Kosovo was an example of that, and Iraq was. There obviously was no UN agreement on that, but there's that in itself gave the idea of the West intervening in a conflict a bad idea. But you're still an advocate for the UN should use its Chapter 7 mandate to intervene where there are legitimate causes.
Well, I would go further than that. I mean, I don't necessarily think you should not act because the UN hasn't sanctioned it. The NATO intervention in Kosovo and in Bosnia was not sanctioned by the UN, and yet it was the right thing to do. I mean, the population of Kosovo was being ethnically cleansed by Serbia, and NATO's intervention stopped them, and that was the right thing to do. just as it would have been the right thing to do to intervene in Syria, to attack Assad after he crossed the red lines that Obama had put down about the use of chemical weapons against his own people. That, I was working with the Syrian opposition at the time, and they wanted intervention to stop, a vicious, cruel dictatorship from repressing his own people. So I'm a kind of liberal hawk, if you like, but I limit what I support to defending other people. I think we have an absolute right to self-defense ourselves, but we have a right also to help those who are defending themselves. So we should, for instance, be supporting Ukraine in every way we possibly can to help them resist the Russian invasion. We're right to support Kosovo. We were right to intervene in Libya to stop Gaddafi killing all his own people, but then a mess was made of the aftermath of that. And so, military intervention does carry with it a lot of long-term responsibilities, which many of the countries that perform these interventions don't really understand.
Carne, this has been a fantastic conversation. We've covered a huge amount of ground, and it's been really interesting talking to you. Look, just before we go, can you just mention again the documentary that you did where you visited Rojava, and also I'm going to mention the debit card that you tried to produce as well.
Yeah, well, I'm having another go at that, interestingly. I'm trying to start up a kind of collectively owned fintech, financial technology startup. But anyway, that's another story. The film is called Accidental Anarchist, and there are places you can watch it. There's a place called Collectiva Media. You can watch it online, and I would recommend that you watch the longer version. There is a BBC cut because it was broadcast on BBC4, which is an hour long, and there's a longer version which is an hour and 20 minutes long. But actually, and I would say this, of course, but the longer version is much better.
Well, if you send us the link or description of where you can find it, we'll certainly send it out to people. Carne Ross, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. And I hope we can have you back again before long and do another discussion on another topic. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it, the discussion.